Welcome to Read, Pray, Write, Spiritual Reading for Modern Life. I'm Jean Kelly. In a minute, I'll introduce today's guest, who offers her work as inspiration for a session of spiritual reading. If you're not familiar with the practice of spiritual reading, you can subscribe to the Grace Lines newsletter and receive a free ebook about the 4 steps, which are simply read, reflect, respond, receive. I like to say that if you can read, you can meditate. If you can write, you can pray. The gifts of this practice of spiritual reading, the space, pace, and grace to go deeper in your life, are available to everyone, regardless of faith, denomination, or belief. You can also visit www.readpraywrite.com for resources, including guided meditations for spiritual reading, suggested texts for the practice as well.
I am Gracie Morbitzer. This is an excerpt from the introduction of my book, The Modern Saints, a compilation of essays about the saints illustrated by my artwork. I had grown up in the faith, and I honestly loved and truly believed many aspects of it. So it saddened me that the people around me had been so vehemently against it when I found it could be so beautiful and healing. But how could I blame them? In the name of this religion, they had been kicked out of their homes, had their identities laughed at or labeled as evil and wrong, and had been judged harshly all their lives. I suppose the only difference for me, and the only reason I might still hold on to this space at all, was that despite my own trauma in the name of religion, I had at least a few Christians in my life who were genuinely loving and caring, and they modeled how their own faith could never allow or condone the hatred conveyed by so many others. Some of these Christians were my family or teachers, but some were the saints. The idea of examining the saints, I realized, is exactly what I needed to do, not only to welcome the folks who'd been hurt by the church, to see the hope that could come from learning about stories similar to theirs, but also to show members of the church, the ones who had done the hurting, that they might in fact be casting out and abusing future saints. We have so much in common with saints, these figures from history, and what part of the story of the Christian faith they bring to the table. They were, in fact, like you and me, and we can also be like them, no matter our position on faith, how we may have been hurt or hurt in the past. The humanity of the saints can bring us healing, empathy, hope, more questions, and a place to start on this journey.
Today we are blessed with the presence of Gracie Morbitzer, a visual artist who paints portraits of the saints as models of how we might live a life of deep faith, meaning, and social action. The authenticity of her artwork, along with the prayers she writes, asking for help from these holy men and women from history as intercessors, has earned her a large social media following as a faith and spirituality influencer. She is also the editor, illustrator, and writer of a new book, The Modern Saints, Portraits and Reflections of the Saints. So Grace, thank you for being with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I can't wait to talk about the amazing saints.
Yeah, I have been so impressed by not only your artwork and your writing, but also your reach and influence. A friend of mine posted to social media a display she had made somewhere in Iowa, and I noticed on the table what looked like your work, a holy card, and sure enough it was. So you're everywhere. I love it. And even though this is the first book you've ever written, it's with a large publisher, an imprint of a large publisher, and you've managed to get contributions in the collection from some of the top faith and spirituality writers. So congratulations on that. That's awesome. Today you provided a reading about why you started painting saints, or why saints became important to you when you're an art student in art college. Not that long ago, not that many years ago. And so can you tell us more about that experience, including like how and why you came to focus your work after that on portraits of the saints?
Definitely. So as I mentioned, I'd grown up going to Catholic school, and that was somewhere where I never quite had felt like I fit in. But when I went to art school, friends and family members who had known me from my Catholic school background were also really worried about me not fitting in this much more progressive creative space, because there were no real faith-based groups on campus, no Bible studies or anything at the time, nowhere where I could really express my faith in a community that was related to the school at all. So what I did was, when I was looking for art supplies at yard sales, like I still continue to do on a regular basis, I found some free pieces of wood that reminded me of what traditional icons had been painted on in the past. And being a very broke college student, took those home right away. And I decided I wanted something for my dorm room to express that faith, that I couldn't find another avenue to express in this space, and decided I wanted to paint the Sacred Heart of Jesus and Immaculate Heart of Mary. But I really couldn't decide on a style that I wanted to paint those in. I didn't feel right painting something super traditional in this college progressive space. And I was so tired of some of that imagery too, but I couldn't quite explain why yet, until I started on this project. So I was too excited to start, though, and began with the figure of Jesus, but couldn't decide what to have him wear. So the longer I looked through art books and browsed through art painting styles and tried to decide on a style, I left him in what basically looked like a white t-shirt. And the longer I sat with that, the more I realized that that itself was really interesting. Icons are meant to be contemplated, and contemplating him wearing something like the students around me, looking like the people that I know, was very powerful and brought up some new ideas for me. So I painted the image of Mary to be wearing modern clothing as well, and was going to leave it at that until I posted those images on social media. And all of friends and family from my Catholic background were asking for modern renditions of the saints that were important and close to them. I think that they saw something powerful too in seeing these people represented in a way that was not only relatable, but also in a way that they hadn't really ever thought to think of them in. And it brought up new ideas and perspectives about these people they thought they knew really well.
So a serendipitous occasion or discovery that you had a really strong response of your audience from, and decided to pursue it a little further. And now are you pretty exclusively doing this kind of work? I understand you weren't a painting major at all in college, so...
Yes, definitely. I didn't take any painting classes until senior year, and that was just a elective of oil painting, and that's not the medium I use now. But it's what I do for my full-time job. Most of it is not painting, however. There are a lot of other sides to running a small business I wasn't quite expecting, but they're all things that I felt were interesting and exciting and worth it to me to pursue. And so every little bit of it is amazing. And after I graduated, I worked full-time for a year in my interior architecture major. And then after that, I transitioned into doing this full-time, started working in a studio. And all of that is just something I am so grateful and excited to do every day.
So you mentioned how in the past ancient iconography functioned as far as like what the wood panels were like. And I know you consider yourself a modern iconographer, choosing to kind of update both the process and the images for a modern audience, many of which are your peers. So could you tell me how that works, a little bit of the history of iconography, and then how you go about creating one of these works? And who do we have here? We have a picture of...
Definitely. This is Saint Simon the Zealot, and it's one of the first few that I created that I still have. I don't have many left since most of them are commissions now, so it's nice to be able to hold on to one every once in a while. But yeah, ancient iconography has a very long history and some very strict rules too. People who consider themselves iconographers usually obey a very certain set of rules that was developed around the 11th and 12th century. And if you picture an icon, it usually fits into that description of what these rules entail. So people are constructed of very basic shapes, very specific shapes and lines. They are all based off of an icon that came before. And I think that's super interesting because this is because we hold the first icons to have been divinely created. The face of Jesus on Veronica's veil, images like those. And so each icon is supposed to hold a spark of that divine image because of this. And they also use specific materials, so specific paints, patterns, wood pieces that they are painted on. And they're also referred to as being written rather than painted. And this is not only because of that strong tradition, but also because they're meant to be contemplated. So they are really the visual equivalent of written Bible stories and prayers and histories, and were really used for a lot of education in the early years as well, especially when populations were illiterate. But the main thing about traditional iconography is that the people depicted in these images are meant to look as they are glorified, so like as they are in heaven. So that describes a lot of why they are expressionless, why they are a little distorted, more androgynous. They are supposed to be past all of the trials and challenges of being a human on earth. And this, I can see why it is necessary and why that's a really powerful way to view these people. But it's also not something that I find to be relatable. And I think to be more relatable, to look like us, that's the best way to do it. And being able to relate to these saints helps us realize how we can be saints ourselves, because our stories are just like theirs. And if we see them looking like us, we're more easily able to recognize that those stories are exactly the same.
So I understand you both teach iconography as a meditative practice, and you consider that an expression of your own spirituality and faith. Can you just tell us how that is?
Definitely. So in this traditional form of iconography, the iconographer is always given a assignment and a blessing to create this piece. It's never something they choose to do, and they also don't see it as themselves either, more as the spirit working through them. And it's a very meditative practice. You're always working towards something that is more divine, more heavenly, and the process itself for me is definitely like that. I would say it's full of prayer and meditation and really focusing on who this person was and what I can learn from them. I always write their biographies first to make sure I have a really good grasp of who I think they could be, translate that into how I think that would mean they look today. And I really try to focus on what I can take from their story and what that says about our faith.
And so you think that it's a good idea to modernize your method so they are relatable. Tell me more about why you think the saints are important to today's audiences.
Yeah, so a lot of younger folks and students that I met at school, some of them really wanted to get back to this faith that they grew up with, but they weren't sure where to start. Many of them had not grown up in a faithful home and just really had so many questions, but just found it so unapproachable, or just really felt like there wasn't a place for who they were with their specific identity and story in the church anymore. And so being able to realize the vast diversity of people who have been lifted up by the church in this faith, I think is really powerful for anyone who fits in any of those categories, because you can see by learning about the saints and their stories that there's not just one way to do it. They all had much different desires and passions and skills and talents, and all lived in different places at different times, and yet they were meant for exactly what they needed to do to make their community a much better place, even though it was all so very different from each other's saint.
Yes, so Grace has very generously agreed to let us show another painting of hers and actually lead our listeners through a session of something called Visio Divina, which is Latin for divine seeing. And especially because you talked about these being created, traditional iconography before literacy, and that they are very much texts. And so they are a text that can be used for prayer. And we will be looking at a portrait that is Saints Clare and Francis, who are great friends and mentors to each other. So we will pray and meditate with our eyes. And so look for that episode on the YouTube channel too. And you mentioned that you like to begin with research about the saints. So I know on your website, The Modern Saints by Gracie, you include the life stories and of these holy men and women, but you write them differently. For example, in your story about Saint Teresa of Avila, you say that she struggled with letting go of some toxic friendships, a very updated way to look at her life. So can you tell me more about that and why you reinterpret their stories?
Definitely. So I think something that really can scare people off when they're starting to learn about the saints is realizing how long ago some of them lived. Even back in the 300s, that's such an intimidating gap in time from now until then. And looking at their life story might be a little bit more challenging if we can't bring it basically into the present day and imagine how would that translate into someone who's living in our current society. So updating some of that language to phrases that we might hear on a more regular basis can help us realize that though she struggled with some of these friendships, we would use terminology now that would describe it, such as a toxic friendship. And so being able to realize that she had the same problems that we might have, that makes it a lot more relatable and human of these people.
And one of the features in your website that I love that makes these lives of the saints more relatable today is you have a quiz called Find Your Perfect Patron Saint. And can you explain to our audience how an individual might benefit from having a patron saint and what the heck that is?
So this idea came about specifically for students who were looking for a confirmation saint patron. I remember going through that process, and everyone in my 8th grade class was furiously researching saints, trying to really just pick a name that they like, to be added onto their name. And so I didn't think there was a good process for doing that. And so I wanted to create something that would be more appealing to a younger audience trying to have their first foray, into learning about these saints and into having a much easier process of discovering someone that might be pertinent to them. But for anyone in general, if you are looking for really an example of a role model of someone who has gone through what you've done before, what you are going through before, someone who you might be able to look up to not only for advice, but for, as a heavenly cheerleader, someone who has overcome all of the challenges that you're going through, then finding a patron saint is a great way to do that. And knowing that they have your back about a very specific issue, that's what they're great at being patrons of. So I really developed this quiz as starting with some general, broad questions about what you yourself might want to be remembered for when you are a saint someday. And that can lead you to discovering a saint that had the same interests that you do.
Well, mine, when I took the quiz, my patron turned out to be Matthew, who happens to be my favorite character on The Chosen. So I was very happy about that. And I've asked my producer, Noah Martin, to take the quiz. So I'm going to invite him in and on camera to tell us about his patron saint, which one he got. So Noah, can you tell us the results of your quiz for patron saint?
Yes. So my results were Edith Stein. And I went to the website. It was like 4 or 5 questions. It was very easy to answer the questions and see where it took me. And I had never heard of this person before. And so I was like, all right, well, I'll read about them. I'll see what this means. And so I went ahead, I read about them, and they were not who I was expecting them to be. The name sounded very German, and that is true. Edith lived over the course of the 1920s into the 40s during World War II and Nazi Germany. And so a lot of her faith and her story is based around fighting against religious intolerance and hatred from the Nazis until eventually she had to flee somewhere else. But that never stopped her faith, and she continued preaching and spreading her faith for as long as she could before, I believe, the Nazis caught up. She had the ability to escape one more time, but she made the decision to stay. because if the rest of her people were going to be taken, then she might as well go with them too, because that was what she saw as the right thing to do. So it's a very impressive story about kind of self-sacrifice, or letting their faith be strong enough to the point that it spoke for her entire life.
I think she is considered a martyr. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Right. And was she a convert from Judaism?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Very cool. I love your interpretation of a patron saint being a heavenly cheerleader. So who do you consider your patron saint, whether it was your actual confirmation name or somebody you've adopted?
Yeah, so my confirmation name, I have at least two. So my confirmation name was Genevieve. She was an amazing sister who lived in the Dark Ages in Europe. And even though she started out as a shepherdess and no one really listened to her, she was vegan, so they thought she was a little wild, they really ended up respecting her and listening to her, and she was a strong leader in that community. She befriended the king and persuaded him to release prisoners, and when the city was under siege, she went out by herself on a boat to bring back corn and grain for the people inside because no one else was brave enough to go, so she did it herself. So she's really amazing. I consider her a great patron saint for leaders, especially women who are not disbelieved or who are disbelieved and called crazy whenever they try to do anything. But then also over the years, I discovered Saint Hildegard of Bingen, who is now my favorite patron saint as well, for basically everything else. She did everything creative, painting, writing, creating poetry, operas, plays, music, and she also was a strong leader. She spoke up for women, broke many barriers, even though she was supposed to be a cloistered nun at this time, wrote letters to people in charge, letting them know if she thought they weren't doing the right thing. But she also discovered a lot of remedies, herbal remedies and medicines, and she learned about plants, and we have still all of those recordings that she discovered and still use some of those things today. So I just think it's amazing that she was always creating, like always using her time and her gifts to create, to give back, and then also appreciating creation itself. So she had visions about deforestation and pollution, and this was back in the Dark Ages. So she really had a strong care for creation and knew what we needed to do to protect it too.
Great. So you're saying that we can have more than one patron saint?
You can have as many as you would like.
Now, how many saints have you painted portraits of so far, roughly?
About 150.
Okay. So who would be the most badass saint of all, in your opinion?
That's a good question. I think that some of them are badass for different reasons. So some of them did amazing things like Saint Hildegard, who I just described, and some of them, just never gave up, like her with her persistence. But some of them also had wild miracles attributed to them. Sometimes they're kind of funny. So two of them were Saint Denis, who was beheaded and picked up his head to carry it another several miles because he was in the middle of preaching, didn't want to be stopped. And another is Saint Lawrence, who not only lied to the Romans to make a joke when they asked him to bring them all their gold, and he brought all of the people in the church who were suffering instead, but also that made them so mad they decided to murder him by grilling him, basically. And he said in the middle of being tortured that he was done on one side and was ready to be flipped over. So I think he's up there too.
That is both of those pretty badass, if you ask me.
Yes.
So I think you alluded to it earlier in the great variety of life stories that you research. Do you believe that any of us can be a saint?
Oh, definitely. I completely believe that. I mean, so many of these saints were not only gifted and talented in different ways, but they also had different hardships that they had to overcome. They had different families that they were born into. Some were very wealthy, some had no money, some had a great family, some had no family at all. But then they also all had much different flaws too. Like we would describe them as, some of them, like St. Paul, were, attacking Christians at first. And some of them, like Augustine, had vices and habits that he had to break before he became a saint. So not even if you wouldn't consider yourself a saint as you are today, we all have that goal, if we believe that this is the faith that we believe in, and any of us can get there. And I think the saints are a great way to realize that, because they have all of these different flaws and backgrounds.
Wow, that's exciting, right?
Definitely.
To think that we should work in that direction. So one of the things I also like that you've done on your website and on your social is that when it's a feast day, when the church has set aside a special day for a particular saint, and sometimes there's more than one saint on any feast day or any day of the year, that you also post fundraisers for social causes. How do you choose those, and why do you do that on those feast days?
Yeah, so each fundraiser is also accompanied by other suggestions on how you can celebrate that feast day. I don't think that feast days are as big of a deal in our current day and age as they used to be, and not in this country as much either as they are elsewhere. But these days are really meant to honor this saint and celebrate who they were. It usually falls on the date that they died rather than they were born. So it was to celebrate their life and all that they did. And so what I really try to do is figure out, what would this saint still be doing if they were alive today, and who is doing that work. And those people, I find, are in the organizations that I do the fundraisers for. So any charities or groups that are continuing the work this saint might have done. So if, for example, they started hospitals, it would be a group that funds organizations for hospitals, things like that. And then the other suggestions are also something specific to do with this saint, maybe something they enjoyed, something they did, like maybe they wrote a lot of letters. And so the suggestion is to write a letter to those that you love, really just to yourself be able to continue doing the work that this saint would have been doing today.
That's great. That is often the fifth step, I guess, of spiritual reading, which is the idea of taking action in some sort, which I call resolve, to do something differently, take some sort of action. So it's really helpful that on your website you make those suggestions. That's really cool. So I'm curious, has your work met, because your work is updating what the images of the saints, making them a little more modern in what they look like, have you met any resistance?
Definitely, yes. The struggle, especially when I was in school still, was that my work always seemed to be a little bit too secular for religious spaces and too religious for secular spaces. So it was so hard to find an audience. I used to try and do art shows in person, and that was just too much rejection. So being able to finally discover this community online that was so much more vast than I ever expected it to be was not only great for the work, but just so uplifting to know that there's so many more people out there who had these same ideas that I do. But because of that, because I do think that it really is impacting people in a positive way, it's also received a lot of negativity. But I do remember that is only because it is actually doing something. I'm actually accomplishing something.
So that's how you manage that pushback, is
right.
Not losing your motivation, not losing your passion for what you're doing, is you realize both good and bad is meaning it's having an effect. There's an audience out there.
Right. No one would be complaining or angry if it didn't have some kind of impact. So
in this season of Read, Pray, Write, I'm asking both listeners and guests a version of the same question, which is, how do you find the space, pace, and grace to go deeper in your life? And deeper can mean all sorts of things. It could be deeper in self-knowledge, self-acceptance, could be deeper in faith. So that's what I want to ask you, Grace. How do you find, or sometimes recognize, or stay open to grace in your life so that it helps you go deeper?
Definitely. I think that's so important to this whole project, honestly, because being open when I was an RA in college, to the stories of these students around me who had such a different experience of faith and who had lived vastly different lives as well. That was what I think really brought about not only all of these new ideas for this project, but also a huge shift in my faith as well, and for the better. I really think that finding wisdom and love in places that I wasn't expecting and had never been told to expect to find them was a huge step in developing all of this. And so continuing to do that, I think, is the most important thing, to be open to finding that love and wisdom where I may not have been expecting it or where it doesn't seem like it should be, and realizing that it can come from anyone and all of us at the same time.
Grace. So grace as being open.
Definitely.
Awesome. So, well, Grace, I wanted to thank you for being here today. Grace Morbitzer is the author of The Modern Saints. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. Thank you.
And in the show notes and on our website and socials, you'll find links to Grace's website and her Etsy shop, because she's a creative who's supporting herself in this ministry. So please patronize her. It is my hope that our guest today, Grace Morbitzer, and all Read, Pray, Write listeners can find the space, pace, and grace they need to go deeper in their lives by listening to this and other episodes found at www.readpraywrite.com. Also by just subscribing to Grace Lyon's newsletter, which is linked on our socials and website. And I hope everyone listening will share the love and wisdom of this episode with others in your life. All of us at Read, Pray, Write wish you all blessings. I am Jean Kelly.